Welcome back, space enthusiasts. I am Hurry.
And I am Kimi. Welcome to another deep dive into the fascinating world of aerospace history. Today we are talking about a mission that literally shook things up, Apollo 6.
That is right. And Kimi, I have a question for you to start us off. What do you do when your giant multi-stage rocket is not quite ready, but you still need to pretend it is fully built so you can test the rest of it?
Well, I'm guessing you do not just stack up a bunch of cardboard boxes and duct tape.
Close. You use a massive dumbbell-shaped spacer, but we'll get to that hilarious little engineering workaround in a bit.
I can't wait. So let us set the stage. Apollo 6, also known as AS-502, launched on April 4, 1968. This was the third and final uncrewed flight in the United States' Apollo program, and only the second test of the mighty Saturn V launch vehicle.
Exactly. The main goal here was to prove that the Saturn V could safely carry a crew. They wanted to demonstrate that the third stage, known as the SIVB, could propel itself and the Apollo spacecraft out to lunar distances. It was basically a dress rehearsal before putting human lives on top of a giant, controlled explosion.
A very expensive, heavily engineered explosion. The plan was to send a command and service module along with a simulated lunar article called a lunar test article into a translunar trajectory. They were not actually aiming to hit the moon, just pass beyond its orbit.
Then they were going to turn the command and service module around, separate from the third stage, fire the engine to simulate a direct return aboard, and hurl it back into Earth's atmosphere at a blistering 11,100 meters per second. The whole round trip was only supposed to take about 10 hours.
But getting to launch day was a saga in itself. Parts started arriving at the Kennedy Space Center in early 1967. And remember that dumbbell you mentioned earlier?
Yes, the S2 second stage just wasn't ready, so to keep testing the rest of the stack, they used a spacer that had the exact same height, mass, and electrical connections as the real stage. Just a giant metal placeholder so they could keep working while they waited.
It's amazing how practical these rocket scientists had to be. They also ran into some serious infrastructure issues. Apollo 6 was the first mission to use high day 3 of the vehicle assembly building. And guess what? The air conditioning could not handle the load.
A billion-dollar space facility defeated by the legendary Florida humidity. They had to bring in portable, high-capacity units just to keep the equipment and the workers from melting. And speaking of unexpected surprises, when the command and service module finally arrived from North American Aviation, Kenneth Kleinknecht, the module manager in Houston, was happy to see it, but absolutely furious about how it was packaged.
Oh, this is a crazy detail. They shipped this highly sensitive spacecraft wrapped in flammable mylar. After the tragic Apollo 1 fire just a year earlier, which was caused by flammable materials and a spark, you would think they would avoid anything combustible like the plague.
Seriously. Though to the manufacturer's credit, this module, CSM-020, only had about 23 routine problems. For comparison, the ill-fated Apollo 1 module arrived with hundreds of unresolved issues. They had also installed a brand new crew hatch on this one.
Right, the old hatch was condemned by the Apollo 1 investigation board because it was far too difficult to open in an emergency. So Apollo 6 was a critical test for this redesigned quick-release hatch under extreme lunar return conditions.
We should also mention the lunar test article, LTA-2R. It did not have any flight systems, but its tanks were filled with a water glycol mixture and freon to simulate the weight of real fuel. The ascent stage was made of ballasted aluminum packed with vibration and acoustic sensors.
So after months of delays, largely because personnel and equipment were busy working on Apollo 4, they finally rolled the whole stack out to Launch Complex 39A on February 6, 1968. And even that rollout was a total disaster.
It rained heavily all day. The giant crawler transporter lost communications and had to just sit there in the downpour for 2 hours. They did not reach the pad until it was completely dark, and then high winds kept them from moving the mobile service structure for another 2 days.
But despite the weather and the endless delays, launch day finally arrived, April 4, 1968. At exactly 7 a.m. Eastern Time, Apollo 6 lifted off, and for the first 2 minutes, everything looked perfect.
Until the pogo oscillation started.
Ah, pogo. It sounds like a fun playground toy, but it is terrifying when you are riding a Saturn V rocket.
Absolutely terrifying. The thrust variations in the SIC first stage caused the entire rocket to violently shake up and down. The vehicle experienced G-forces of plus or minus 0.6 G. It was only designed to handle a maximum of 0.25 G.
George Mueller, the NASA Associate Administrator for Manned Spaceflight, later explained this to a House committee using a brilliant analogy. He said the fuel pipes feeding the engines act like organ pipes, creating their own resonance frequency.
Exactly. The whole structure of the rocket was vibrating longitudinally like a giant tuning fork. It actually shook so hard that a panel broke off the spacecraft lunar module adapter, or SLA. Thankfully, the rest of the first stage somehow held together.
But the drama was far from over. After the first stage dropped away, the S2 second stage kicked in, and its J2 engines immediately started acting up. Engine number 2 began struggling, and eventually, the instrument unit shut it down completely.
And here is where human error really made things interesting. 2 seconds after engine 2 was shut down, engine number 3 suddenly stopped as well.
Let me guess, someone got their wires crossed.
Literally, the wires carrying the shutdown command were cross-connected. Engine 3 was running perfectly fine, but the computer accidentally killed it while trying to manage engine 2. So now the second stage is down 2 out of its 5 engines.
That is wild, but this is where the Saturn V's onboard guidance system, the instrument unit, proved its worth. It realized it was losing thrust, so it dynamically compensated by burning the remaining 3 engines for an extra 58 seconds.
It is incredible that a guidance system in 1968 could adapt on the fly like that. The third stage also had to burn 29 seconds longer to make up for the deficit. They managed to reach a parking orbit, though it was much more elliptical than they wanted.
But the bad news just kept coming. When it was time for the third stage to restart and simulate the translunar injection, it just flat out failed. It simply would not ignite.
So, Mission Control, led by Flight Director Clifford E. Charlesworth, had to pivot to a pre-planned alternate mission. They used the Service Propulsion System engine on the spacecraft itself to raise the orbit to a massive 22,204 kilometers.
Which was a great backup plan to complete some objectives. But because they used up that fuel going up, they did not have enough left to accelerate back down into the atmosphere. They hit a re-entry speed of 10,000 meters per second, falling short of the 11,000 needed to truly simulate a lunar return.
Still, they gathered great data on how the skin of the spacecraft would protect astronauts from the Van Allen belts. And 10 hours after launch, the command modules splashed down safely in the North Pacific, though it was about 80 kilometers off target. It was quickly recovered by the USS Okinawa.
So after all that, the pogo shaking, the ripped adapter panels, the engine failures, the cross-wiring, and the missed speed targets, how did NASA view the mission?
It depended on who you asked. At the post-launch press conference, Apollo program director Samuel Phillips admitted it was less than perfect, but called reaching orbit a major unplanned accomplishment.
I love that corporate spin. Major unplanned accomplishment. We didn't mean to do it this way, but look, we survived.
Right? George Mueller initially called it a successful mission because they learned so much, though he later admitted it really had to be defined as a failure.
But here is the beautiful part about engineering failures. They teach you exactly what needs to be fixed. NASA put roughly 1,000 engineers to work solving the pogo issue. They added helium gas into the valve cavities to act as a shock absorber.
And they figured out what happened to those J2 engines. During ground testing, the supercold propellants formed a layer of frost that acted as a natural dampener for the metal bellows in the fuel lines.
But in the vacuum of space, there is no frost. Without that protective layer of ice, the bellows vibrated rapidly and failed at peak flow, burning through the lines. So they replaced them with rigid bends. They also drilled holes in the honeycomb structure of the adapter panels, so trapped air and water could escape, preventing them from blowing off again.
It is fascinating that the extreme vacuum of space revealed a critical flaw that was literally masked by the atmospheric pressure and humidity on Earth.
I also love the internal debate that happened afterward. They considered installing a pogo abort sensor that would automatically trigger a launch abort if it shook too hard. But Deke Slayton, the director of flight crew operations, opposed it. They eventually decided the astronauts could judge for themselves.
Can you imagine a computer deciding to abort a moon mission just because of some turbulence? Deke definitely made the right call there. Let's talk about the visual side of this mission. The Saturn V had several cameras attached to it, designed to film the stage separations and then eject.
Yeah, designed being the operative word. 3 of the 4 cameras on the first stage completely failed to eject because they lacked nitrogen pressure in the bottles, so they were destroyed. Only 1 from the second stage was recovered, though it did get some great footage of the separation.
And because the mission ran longer than planned, the motion picture camera inside the command module missed the re-entry events entirely. However, they did have a 70mm still camera pointing out the hatch window, taking photos of Earth. And those photos were phenomenal. They used a special haze-penetrating film and filter combination that yielded better color balance and higher resolution than any previous American crewed mission. It was a massive win for geographic and topographic studies.
It really was. Now, despite all the drama and the huge engineering breakthroughs, Apollo 6 barely made a blip in the news. Do you know why?
It is actually a very tragic historical coincidence. Apollo 6 launched on April 4, 1968. That exact same day, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis.
Yeah, the entire nation was in shock and mourning. On top of that, just 4 days earlier, President Lyndon B. Johnson had shocked the country by announcing he would not seek re-election. The political and social climate was just completely overwhelmed.
It really puts things into perspective. The technological triumphs and struggles of the space program were happening against the backdrop of massive cultural and political upheaval in the United States.
Absolutely. But in the context of the Apollo program, Apollo 6 was incredibly consequential. NASA's swift efforts satisfied the Senate Committee on Aeronautical and Space Sciences. Engineers at the Marshall Space Flight Center concluded that they didn't need a third uncrewed test of the Saturn V.
Which is a massive leap of faith, but a calculated one. Their next Saturn V launch was Apollo 8, which famously carried humans all the way to lunar orbit and back.
And today, if you want to see the capsule that survived the pogo shaking and the cross-wired engines, the Apollo 6 Command Module, CM020, is on display at the Fernbank Science Center in Atlanta, Georgia.
A quiet retirement for a spacecraft that had one heck of a chaotic workday.
Well said, Hari. That about wraps up our journey with Apollo 6. It wasn't the flawless flight NASA hoped for, but it was exactly the rigorous test they needed to safely land humans on the moon.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into aerospace history. Take care and keep looking up.
Goodbye, space fans.
This episode is based on the Wikipedia article Apollo 6, which is available under the Creative Commons Attribution Share-alike license. This podcast was crafted using artificial intelligence.